you have already wished Happy New Year once more, and welcome back. Of course, it's very exciting to have the semester recommence with a seminar for the first semester group given by Beatrice and Marc. It's always an honor to have them here. And I don't think Marc needs much of an introduction in this building. I think that would be formal exaggeration. But a personal and small form of appreciation I would like to give you. And you, mostly all of you know that Marc is by now the longest standing teacher in the Staedelschule. He was brought in by Enrique Miralles in the 1990s, and since then he has been here every year, and it is of course equally exciting but also an honor to have him back. The contributions are, as always, important. You know the books, you know of the exhibitions that he has curated, and he just told me, walking over here now, that of course since stopping being the dean at Columbia University, the School of Architecture there is more time to write and more time to dedicate to projects. One of these is tonight, the topic of tonight's lecture, which dates way back and took a break, amongst others, because of the curatorial project in Istanbul that Marc shared with Beatrice. And I think that certainly my appreciation, apart from, of course, the flabbergasting speed and Marc's ability to give words basically wings, is that it is always an inspiringly profound inquiry into the history of the discipline, into particular topics. And I believe personally that this is all the more important at the time when, for all different reasons, some very sad ones, some that just come with impulses with time, that architecture, and particularly so in Germany perhaps, turns very conservative, to have the help to actually to undo some of those things that architecture is hinged on, both in terms of how we think about it, but also how we do it, how we practice it, is the kind of help that is urgent, and it's all the more important for us in an educational setting. So I am sure that you, as much as I do, look incredibly much forward to Marc's lecture tonight. I'm Gordon Matta-Clark. Welcome.
Thank you. So it's always nice to be here, mainly because it's an art school, with all of that, entails. So if the artist is, or should be, or could be, the person who allows a society to see itself by seeing things differently, and in seeing things differently, see yourself for the first time, and in seeing yourself for the first time, already be a different person, and so on. So if art is a way of helping people to see themselves, like this very traditional idea of art, then having an architecture program in an art school means thinking about how would architecture help people to see themselves for the first time. So not to represent them, not to monumentalize them, not to carry out any important function, not to answer any question that was asked of it, but precisely to raise questions or answer questions that were not asked. Famously, you could say a good architect is somebody that doesn't give the client what the client wants or asks for, but what the client wished that they had asked for, and later will pretend that they did ask for. And this person who pretends that they asked for this house or this whatever is a different person already. In my experience, nobody likes architects. By which I mean nobody likes to hire an architect, and even those who hire architects don't like to pay architects, and for good reason, because the architect is an absolutely unnecessary figure. right? If you need to be warm or sheltered or stable and so on, the architect is not the person to do that, because the architect precisely is something like an artist, the person who asks questions. And then you might say, well, then why does anybody ever ask an architect to do anything? Well, firstly, they don't ask architects to do a lot. If you would say, what is the role of the architect in German society today, for example, it would be quite difficult to come up with an answer. If you would ask the question, what's the role of an artist in German society, it's quite easy to answer. And you can point to all the institutions and all the apparatus devoted to that. You can take any newspaper printed anywhere and look at it and say, does this newspaper help me to understand the position of art in society? And you can use almost any newspaper, even a copy of the newspaper that has no column on art, and you can locate art within that. If you ask the same question, what is the role of architecture in German society? Let me look at newspapers to determine that. It will not be as easy as you think to discover the meaning of art, of architecture, which means that somewhat strangely, architecture has quietly slid into the position that used to be occupied by art, and art is often treated with some scorn because it's seen to have become a part of industrialized, capitalized society. That is to say, not only does the artist know what she or his role in society is, but that role is deeply built into economic systems of various kinds and so on. And you can either say, oh, I hate the art world of today because it's just part of the market, etc., 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 and even its critiques of the market are fully part of the market, as is always the case with markets. Markets want to have this kind of decorative impulse. So weirdly enough, and one could even argue that artists, and I shouldn't say this here in an art school, but it might be true, artists could have reasonably clear expectations as to what might be the kind of rewards that society would offer, depending on which behaviors they would adopt. So clear is it that those behaviors can be adjusted as a form of performance, and a lot of what constitutes art today constitutes a strategic form of behavior, knowing what it is that's expected of an artist, and therefore behaving in a certain way to play with those expectations. And that, in a certain sense, is the history of the most interesting art of the last 100 years or so, has been that art which has fully understood the normative reactions to the art world and has performed in relationship to those expectations. Meanwhile, the architect is unsure, if you believe me, unsure of his or her role in society, and therefore actually unsure how to perform. So an architecture school embedded in an art school is a very, very, from my perspective then, a very, very interesting laboratory for these questions to be thought through. And Matta-Clarke is, of course, somebody who was trained as an architect, is a graduate of the Cornell School, so an elitely trained architect who is known as an artist, and there's a kind of a paternity suit. Like artists definitely claim him, you know, Matta-Clarke belongs to us. He's not just any old artist, he's one of the artists, he's an artist's artist, and it is really hard to find a single artist that has such a kind of respect and interest and curiosity that straddles almost every generation of artists and every different type of artist. It's very, very hard to find an artist who says, you know, frankly, I'm a little bit bored with Matta-Clarke. Right? Matta-Clarke is even one of those figures who acts as a representative of the ambition of what an artist could be in terms of the performance, the media work, the politics, and so on. So it's an enormously interesting and celebrated artist. It's an artist who, by now, is an absolutely required reading in any art history course. He is required in any museum. Knowledge of him is required of any curator. It's quite hard to be a curator and never have touched in any way Matta-Clarke. So Matta-Clarke is almost a kind of monumental figure now in the so-called art world, which is quite complicated then. How could he be so challenging? How could he have disturbed so many assumptions if it is that he is so securely now positioned within this kind of situation? So I would like to try to think that the lecture today is an attempt to try to explain this very, very odd situation where somebody can be a radical figure of the possibility of art to challenge conventional understandings of the world that we live in, and at the same time be a kind of fully celebrated figure within an art world that would be really hard-pressed to describe itself as offering a kind of alternative to normative society. It seems to be much more built into the norms of society. This research began a very long time ago based on a simple observation that this most celebrated of artists, the understanding of him is based on an exhibition, the so-called Anarchitectureexhibition, that is supposed to have happened in March of 1974, for which there is no evidence that it ever occurred. In other words, one of the most famous artists of the 20th century is understood through a concept of anarchitecture, which is associated with an exhibition that we don't know it happened. And it's not like the fact that there is no evidence that the exhibition happened has interfered with the celebration of this figure. Actually, it seems to be totally related to that. So my research was based on what is the relationship between this super invisible exhibition, the most unknown invisible exhibition of all time, which may not have happened, and the fame of this person, and might there be a relationship between the invisibility of one exhibition and the hypervisibility of the work? Two apparently contradictory symptoms made this research seem urgent. The first is, I was so impressed that no one ever noticed that this unnoticed exhibition on architecture, while that exhibition was supposedly on show, Matta-Clarke had already begun work on splitting his by far and away most famous work, the canonic work, that is to say the most visible work of the most visible artist, or at least one of the most visible artists of the 20th century, was in formation at exactly the moment that the least visible work done by that artist was occurring. So point number one, surely there must have been some kind of intimacy between this so-called Anarchitectureexhibition that we don't know anything about and splitting, which apparently we know everything about. The second symptom, which seems to be a contradictory symptom to that, is nobody seemed to notice or want to notice that Matta-Clarke, when he did splitting, insisted that it was not an architecture. Right? So you've got these two symptoms. One is that it seems that the Anarchitectureexhibition and the production of splitting, the cutting of a house in half, are directly and intimately related. And secondly, he said they were not. And so what's amazing to me, in a kind of psychoanalytical sense, is that the field of art and the discussion of art was fully able to imagine an extraordinarily intimate relationship with an invisible exhibition without any curiosity about what that exhibition might have been. In fact, as in all things psychoanalytical, a total disinterest in discovering what it was that is not seen in order to celebrate that. So, to Matta-Clarke is by far and away my favorite image of him. He's hanging inside a cocoon in a tree in Vassar College on the May the 1st of 1971. He sees us like he sees you perfectly. You are up the tree to see him. He's already up there. He looks at you with a look which is that you've somehow caught him, but you're meant to have caught him. And is he human? Is he insect? Is he animal? Is he bird? What is it? Very, very unclear. And there is this sort of general question, what the hell is he doing there? But even more the question, what the hell are you doing looking at him? And anyway, how could I show you this picture? Because someone had to be up there to take the photograph, to select the photograph, to frame it, to archive it, to publish it so that I could reproduce it and show it to you here. And hear this word, an architecture. And maybe you don't really need to listen to this lecture. Maybe you just need to listen to that word, an architecture. Just sort of hear it. Obviously, inside that word is an architecture. So nothing controversial, and architecture, or everything controversial, and like not architecture. So the first resonance of the word is an architecture is not architecture, something else, something other than architecture. But then again, why would the word architecture still be in there if it's been so dissolved? So it's not architecture, but it's also not architecture. It's sort of like architecture leaving itself behind. It's like architecture leaving its own skin. It's just on the way out. It's near architecture. It's not architecture, but it's not quite not architecture. And of course, anarchy is in there as well, very clearly. But again, it's anarchy. It doesn't seem like architecture turned into anarchy. It's not anarchy yet. It's more like anarchy becoming architecture than architecture becoming anarchy, or at least it's both. It's like the architecture of anarchy, the texture of it, the shape, the structure of it, or the other way around. At least it's a kind of a vibration. And in this word then, in this word anarchitecture, which by the way, I have to warn you, is highly contagious word, and there's no cure to this word. Nobody ever looks at this word and says, oh no, I'm not interested. It's incredibly beguiling. It kind of invites you to point to an architecture. And why does it invite you to point? Because architecture is something you can point to, right? The tradition of architecture is architecture stance. It's something that stands up and represents something. Architecture is something you can point to. That's why you can talk about the architecture of a politician, or the architecture of a society, or the architecture of a meal. It seems to be that, precisely that which you can point to. But an architecture is interesting exactly in the sense that you can't point to it. It would seem like almost anything that you call an architecture is not quite an architectural anymore once you have called it that. Right? So by the way, could you have an exhibition of an architecture? Because if you put something on exhibition, on display, have you already turned it into something like no longer an architecture? Is the invisibility of the Anarchitecture show, and the fact that it might not have happened because actually such a concept is not possible, that you cannot exhibit an architecture. An architecture might be something always there, always in operation, but not something one can, as it were, shape. You certainly could not design it. You could not be an architect, right? But precisely what Matta-Clarke is described as an architect, right? In these kind of famous projects here, Conical Intersect in Paris, or in Office Baroque in Antwerp, or in Circus Caribbean in Chicago. In these huge projects he does at the end of his life, these are always referred to as an architecture. Books about him, exhibitions about him are always called an architecture or the an architect. The most recent, it's up now, Matta-Clarke, an architect. And it's a great show. I mean, it's a super good show, very, very thoughtfully produced. But if an architecture is not possible, not something you can do, you can't be an architect, how is it that we always refer to this figure as an architect in this kind of a way? Was he paying attention to Dubuffet's 1959 set of prints of the distressed surfaces of buildings, which had the name an architect? Right? Was he tuning into this? Did he know about Robin Evans' article Towards an Architecture, which of course is a play on Le Corbusier's Towards an Architecture, the most famous book of 20th century architectural theory? He was certainly aware of Gianni Pettiner's An Architetto, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Architect, because Portrait of the Artist as a Young Architect sounds exactly like a description of Matta-Clarke. Matta-Clarke was very upset when hearing about this book and was very, very happy to report that there was nothing in it that constitutes an architecture from his point of view. Right? And who was he reporting? He was reporting to the so-called Anarchitecture group, that is the group that had put on this mythical exhibition. So he's reporting to the Anarchitecture group that's making an exhibition that we don't know, that it's okay, this book has nothing to do with an architecture, even though it has the name. What I'm wanting to insist is, Matta-Clarke supposedly coins this word in the early 1970s, and the first time we hear its use is something like 1973, and he uses it to name a group of fellow artists who hold a series of meetings in their lofts in downtown New York to discuss the concept of Anarchitecture. They're called the Anarchitecture group because all they do is sit and say, what the hell does the word Anarchitecture mean? It's a great word, but what does it mean, right? And they then supposedly held this collaborative exhibition in March of 1974 called Anarchitecture at the 112 Green Street space, which was a loft space with very, very high ceilings in their downtown neighborhood. Again, we don't know whether the word is kind of coming from the ether, from this atmosphere. There are many other examples I could give you of the use of the word. We know that for Matta-Clarke, the word clearly resonated with words that he had been using since 1971, like undoing. He would often refer to himself as undoing a building, or unbuilding, or destructuring, or defunctionalizing, or his references to restructuring, reorganizing, retranslating, redefining, and rethinking. And architecture seems to be connected to all of those other words. And yet this word had a special, unique resonance for him. He was endlessly fascinated with what it might mean. And architecture for Matta-Clarke was first and foremost a question. That's why you need a group. It's a question. It's not an answer. It's a question. So you have a group to discuss what it might possibly mean. So of course it's super strange to then take this word and point to him or point to a work and say that's an architecture, Because that's like saying, like if the word Anarchitecture has to do with gaps in our understanding, and you don't understand Matta-Clarke, and you call him an Anarchitect, you're actually using a word which means gaps in understanding to explain your own gap in understanding Matta-Clarke. Like it's just, like the word itself is a form of leaking, you know? And architecture sort of leaks. And architecture is not architecture, but it's architecture sort of like leaking away or dissolving in your fingers. It's a sort of loss of something, right? So if you point to something and say, there's an architecture, you're actually using the word against itself. You're trying to stop the word. You're working against the word. You're not really describing the art that you're referring to, and I hesitate even to call it art, but whatever it is that you point to and say an architecture by definition is not an architecture, and certainly if you point to someone and say you're an architect, then that's not an architect. You're actually working against the concept of an architecture in that moment. You're treating the question as an answer, right, which is not. But exhibitions, books, and essays, and museums, and galleries, and museums, and auction houses, like if you want to successfully move a certain work around the world, you might refer to it as an architecture. If people have only one paragraph to talk about Matta-Clarke, that word Anarchitecture appears in the paragraph. If they have only one sentence, there's like a 50-50 chance that it's in there. If they have two sentences, 75% chance. In other words, if you want to talk about Matta-Clarke and everybody wants to talk about Matta-Clarke, then they use this word which relates to an exhibition that we don't have any evidence of and nobody quite knows what the word means. In other words, once again, we have this enormously celebrated figure who's described in terms of a word which precisely doesn't help you to understand what the architect is. It sort of says something like, we don't understand. By the way, that might not be so different than referring to somebody as an artist. Right? If an artist is, as I said before, contradicting myself, right? Somebody who allows you to see the world as you couldn't see it before, precisely to point to an artist is to undo that work. Like an artist would be an artist to the extent that you couldn't exactly simply call them an artist. They challenged even your ability to pin them down as an artist. And of course, as you know, most of the artists who we hold in the greatest regard today were at the time of their work considered to be maybe not artists. Like part of the nature of such a project would be, it would never be clear that you were such a thing as an artist. The word artist might be a retroactive comment on the extent to which somebody has managed to change the way you see the world. At the time they did the work, they might not be considered artists at all. They might be considered scientists or mathematicians or painters or architects or anything. They might not ever have wanted the label of artist. So in other words, artist might be a retroactive label, and therefore applying the word artist to somebody, like is it possible that Matta-Clarke is a very, very hardcore, transgressive figure that has been domesticated and made into and celebrated as an artist? And is that possible? Is it possible to celebrate an artist without domesticating them? Like, is it really possible to be famous and still radical? And is it even that the gesture of calling somebody an artist involves some non-trivial domestication, like some degree of restraint on the transgressive capacity of an artist? So I'm taking it as a given, in terms of this lecture, that Matta-Clarke is such a transgressive figure, without yet knowing what that word means, who is being domesticated by a discourse that celebrates him. In other words, precisely it's the celebration of Matta-Clarke that is most interested in, unconsciously interested in, restraining the level of transgressive activity. So then we have this sort of situation. Remember that if you know a little bit about Matta-Clarke and those that write about Matta-Clarke, everything he ever said, every word he ever uttered is offered as evidence for what he was trying to do. Right? Every note, every comment, every label, he's always cited. Since nobody knows what the hell Matta-Clarke's word means, they think, well, we'll just quote him because obviously he knew what he meant, which is a foolish assumption. Right? If there is this figure of the artist that I'm describing, why would you ever imagine that they knew what they were doing when they were doing it? Wouldn't it be more reasonable to assume that an artist doesn't know what they're doing, and precisely that's why they do it, to discover what it is that they're doing, and maybe later has some kind of account of it. So the idea of an artist as a sort of all-knowing, self-conscious person who can say, I am doing this for this reason, once again is undermining that. Nevertheless, Matta-Clarke scholarship always quotes anything that Matta-Clarke ever said as being correct. In other words, they treat the words he used as explanations of his work, either as kind of descriptions of what the work wants to be, or what the work was, or how it should be labeled, and so on. They never treat the words of Matta-Clarke as part of the art, or even as the art itself. Like, what if actually Matta-Clarke was a kind of wordsmith, that he was more like a poet, and everything else, like everything physical, was an attempt to kind of prop up the poetry rather than the other way round? Anybody who writes about Matta-Clarke refers to the fact that nobody understood what he was saying when he said it. That he was a sort of verbally dyslexic, tricky, slippery, multi-dimensional, multimedia person who loved words. So this very person, who is nobody, his closest and deepest friends and admirers all said, I had no idea what he was saying. Those very same words are used to, as it were, pin down the work and to give it a certain credence. My point here is not to condemn the use of the word and architecture by so many critics. In other words, it's not possible to understand Matta-Clarke without thinking of him as an architect. And I'm not saying like, that's stupid, let's go home. I'm saying it's stupid, but let's not go home, because more the question is why? Why is there the need to constantly use this particular term? And at the very least, what I want to say is, I want to suggest a kind of revision of the way we think of Matta-Clarke. Matta-Clarke is typically thought of as a disobedient, wild man, swinging from rooftop to rooftop, cutting through things, doing crazy things. Here is the hair project of 1972, where he didn't cut his hair for a whole year, and at the end of that year had the hair precisely pulled apart and photographed and documented. He made a work out of hair. This is all seen to be part, let's say, of the kind of craziness of his figure. I want to say that if you pay attention to everything he did and everything that he wrote, far from a playful, disobedient, risk-taking, physical, active figure, all evidence points to a highly focused, systematic, intellectual project pursuing a series of a very small set of very, very precisely framed questions to which he had more or less standard answers for the 10 years of his life as an artist. And this was especially the case in the case of Anarchitecture. It was a particularly precise philosophical argument. So the deal then, what was going on in this exhibition, who was in it, and what did they show? The members of the so-called Anarchitecture group have been interviewed since 1980 repeatedly, and all asked what was in the show, and they all describe entirely different shows, right? There's no agreement at all on what was in the show, how many people contributed, what they contributed, why they contributed, how they contributed, whether it was seen. There was no photographs taken of the exhibition, despite the fact that all the people participating in the exhibition were serial photographers, and not just serial photographers, photographers of their own work and of their friends' work. So these were people that were taking on average 100 photographs per day, all of them. And they all just happened to not take any pictures of this exhibition. Nor were pictures of it taken by anyone else, nor were there any reviews published. There's simply no evidence that the thing occurred. We only have 3 pieces of circumstantial evidence that there was an exhibition. On the left, a kind of announcement that there was going to be an exhibition in the gossip section of Avalanche. In the middle, an invitation card sent with Anarchitecture written on a table, sent to lots of people in New York. And finally, in June of 1974, a 2-page spread of flash art, which appears to be a representation of what may or may not have been the show. This is the first piece of gossip saying that there's going to be this exhibition. It's underneath the picture of Jeffrey and Rachel Liu's 2 twins that have just been born, and the news that Smithson has just died in a plane crash. This is very typical Avalanche downtown gossip. They're saying there's going to be this show. It's going to be a catalogue of neither art nor architecture. By the way, since we're in an architecture school talking about art, this is neither architecture nor art, but it's living spaces, right? Will be shown in New York. It's going to be a catalogue. What does that mean? Does that mean it's going to be like a book, or a show that's like a book, or what the hell is it? We know who's involved: Tina Gerard, Susan Harris, Richard Nonis, and Gordon Matta-Clarke. Then we also realize that actually Matta-Clarke is not the same as the others, because Gordon Matta-Clarke, who's splendid, who would have thought that Avalanche would ever use a word like splendid, whose splendid graffiti photograph, such an aristocratic word, what a splendid landscape. It's like a splendid graffiti photograph, so splendid graffiti, like the aristocrats' collection of graffiti. Oh, I really adore that graffiti on the East Bronx. right, whose splintered graffiti photographs were displayed on a Mercer Street sidewalk, so not in the gallery, on the street, so pieces of the street displayed in the street last June, is at present activating factory spaces in Milan and Genoa. Now, because it says Milan and Genoa, we know that this information is coming from November, because in Milan, in October, he does a work in a factory space, and in the 20th in Genoa. So we know more or less that this information is getting to Avalanche via Carol Gooden, who's the partner of Matta-Clarke, who's coming back from Europe. So when this is being published, Matta-Clarke is still in Europe. But what you learn from this is the Anarchitecture exhibition will be a group exhibition, but and it's a group of 4 artists, one of whom is more special than the others, right? And in all of these interviews with all of the people that were in the show, they all disagree about everything except for one thing, that it was a collective work. All of them say, this was not a Gordon Matta-Clarke exhibition. And once you kind of got that point, you say, I know. Then they relax a bit, and then they say, but Gordon was the ringleader, right? So there's sort of always these double binds. It's like, this is not a Matta-Clarke show, but it's definitely his idea, the whole thing. To which you might want to say, then it was his show. Essentially what they do is they construct themselves as accomplices of a crime for which we have no evidence. They want there to be a ringleader, but they don't want the ringleader to act like a ringleader, and they don't want to act like they're being led by someone else, right? So it's going to be an anonymous show of a gang, like any other bank robbery. You need somebody who can drive a car, somebody who can do the locks. Everybody has a different skill, and one of them is definitely the energizing source, but that fact must be remain somehow invisible. Second piece of information, Anarchitecture. But already it's creating problems for us because, okay, did they break Anarchitecture because they just had to break it up to fit it onto the tablecloth? But it does raise the possibility that the show was really the Anarchitecture show, right? Who are we to put the word back together? This is the first time anybody's seen the word, right? So if you see the word for the first time, you can't say, oh no, they mean Anarchitecture, right? Anarchitecture, so that puts the emphasis on the anarchy side of the story. And texture, of course, texture, right? Or is it, because then it says group, is it really the Anarchitecture group show, right? At 112 Green Street? Or is it the Anarchitecture group or the Anarchitecture group? There are like 4 different possible titles for the exhibition coming from this one thing. Remember that the earlier document said that it would be an exhibition of living spaces and some kind of living space here. So there's a weird feeling that whatever an architecture is, it's somehow set in this kind of domestic environment. Then the flash art says an architecture on the left, and then breaks it on the right into an architecture again, so it's not so accidental. And there are 12 images below, or is it one image, one mosaic? Like, is it 12 images? Are these images from the exhibition? It doesn't say. If they are and it doesn't say who they're by, an architecture show. The show was comprised from a collection of photographic notes, so they're photographic notes, they're not like artworks, they're like comments, evolving from a year of group discussion, so 1 year of group discussion around mental, personal, non-structural or architectural notions of space and place. And you notice that the number of artists involved has been expanded because now you get Laurie Anderson, Bernie Kirschenbaum, and Richard Laundrie added to the mix. So basically you get 8 artists where you used to have 4, but you still don't really know what's going on. You notice that the top left image, surely not accidental, is a series of 33 variations of the word Anarchitecture. So this word is sort of breeding. It's not just Anarchitecture or Anarchitecture, it's all of these possibilities. By the way, Anarchitecture is not in the list, right? There is Anarchitecture. So in the Anarchitecture show, there's every other possibility except Anarchitecture. And on the top right is the only thing that looks vaguely architectural, and it's a house, but it's on a barge floating down a river. So architecture is, as it were, on a barge floating down a river while architecture emerges, or it's like an architecture is whatever appears when architecture goes down the river, right, literally. And you're meant to think that. Obviously, these are, if you know those artists, right? This is a group of hardcore, smart, conceptual artists from New York. They don't make mistakes. They are killers. They know exactly what they're doing. Laurie Anderson, like the most brilliant, the most precise, as an artist, as a thinker, as a writer, as a musician, no accidents here, right? So no accidents here. Architecture on the right, everything else disaster. architecture falling apart. Like, this is a very, very precise conceptual work, but they make no comment here about whether this is representation of a show, whether it says there was a show, it doesn't say this is exactly the show. And that's all we've got, those 3 pieces of evidence. So how is it possible that this show that nobody has any evidence of, it becomes somehow important in framing Matta-Clarke as an architect? And it happens in this issue of the magazine Artwright. Artwright is a little downtown magazine, mainly circulating amongst artists on kind of yellow paper. And you see An Architecture in Englewood. So one of the very first articles about Matta-Clarke, written by the editors, says, An Architecture in Englewood, clean cut, shows the house in Englewood, which has been split down the middle, and it's very clear. It says on the left-hand article, just paying attention to the image, a house, the very image of domesticity, even a kind of children's image of what a house is, a very housey house, a very homey home, has been sort of split down the middle. It's a weird image because, yes, the house has been split, even the split has gone right through the window, and yet the house hasn't fallen apart. It seems like it could be either like very stable and occupiable, it's like it has this extra window now in the shape of a kind of a slot, but it's also weirdly symmetrical, and it's like the house is designed to fit the frame of the photograph. Right? The more you look at it, it's just uncanny that every detail, including the trees, is all very, very symmetrical. It's a weird house. So it's a weird image of domesticity, remaining domesticity after being violated like this, as if actually Home Sweet Home was never so sweet at all. Like as if actually a basic house is always cut or always cutting in a certain way. And they position that, you see, at the top of their article. So actually, An Architecture in Englewood first reads as a caption to the image, but then the 3 columns of the text appear immediately underneath. So actually the kind of symmetry of the house organizes the page. And in that house, they describe a bus trip where a group of downtown artists get into a bus and visit this house and are amazed when they go up through the inside. And the argument is that primarily the experience is of physical sculpture, and it's a feeling of distress, psychological torment, as the further you go up the house, the more you feel annoyed. But look at the fact that the page of Artwright has itself been split between the left and the right, and the physical reading on the left is matched by a conceptual meaning on the right by none other than Laurie Anderson that says take 2. It's like take 2. Let's look again. Let's read the house again. There are 2 images. So first of all, we saw the outside of the house. Then we go, you see on the right, we go a little bit into the house. We're on the first floor. Again, it's an uncanny image because it's a regular room that's been sliced. But the slice is weird because the slice has brought light into the house, and in a way the house, if you look at the slice has been lit by the light that's been brought in by the cut. So it's a kind of slot that's in theatrical lit, but it's also a bit like a suture. It's like more like holding it together rather than pulling it apart. And then we get to the top of the house and we see a corner has been removed, but instead of feeling like the corner has gone, like the architecture is no longer controlling you, the corner seems even more kind of emphatically defined by that. So again, 3 images, none of which are credited to Matta-Clarke. They're treated as images, as documentary images of a work of art. The images are not treated as work of art, but they are comments on a work of art. And she makes exactly the argument that the work is conceptual. She says the thing about this house in New Jersey, though, was that it wasn't a house, but a single cut line. And isn't that the weird thing about this image? Is that it's actually not a cut house? Because this house you never would have seen if he hadn't cut it, right? This is a house that was about to be demolished in a largely African-American neighborhood that you would not have visited. So this is not like a house that's then being cut. You never know nothing about this house. You only know about this house because he cut it. It became a house when he cut it. This is the birth of a house. And it's making permanent the house. The house is there forever because he cut it. So this is not about, I got a house and then I cut it. This is about what kind of cut produces a house, right? The other way around. I mean, later I try to demonstrate to you that this is not as sort of tricky as it sounds. There was no house before he made the cut. So in that sense, he didn't cut a house. He made a house by cutting. And this is exactly what she's saying. The thing about this house in New Jersey, though, was that it wasn't a house, but a single cut line. The 2 halves were elaborate, non-functional buttresses. Their purpose is to reveal a line that changed everything and sent his house reeling out of the realm of architectural possibility and architecture. This is Gordon Matta-Clarke's word for it, and he is the one who did it, sawed the house in half. So this is like, again, written with the extreme clarity of Laurie Anderson. She's saying he didn't cut a house, he made a line and he used a house to hold the pieces of that line in place, and this holding of a line with pieces of architecture is architecture leaving itself behind, that is an architecture. And she insists he's the one that named it, right? This is his word, and he's the one that did it. Of course, by now you must be thinking to yourself, well, that's weird. She never mentions the Anarchitecture group, of which she's a member. So basically, this house becomes the figure of Anarchitecture, and the person, Laurie Anderson, who names it Anarchitecture, is one of the group who was participating in the exhibition, which was up so recently. And this is the beginning. Now, her gesture then gets repeated in this article in Art in America. Now a much bigger audience, we get more pictures, so now we get we feel ourselves moving up and through the house. Now the photographs are accredited to Matta-Clarke, the same photographs we saw before. We are now acknowledged that they are Matta-Clarke's photographs. The writer L. Brunel is also an artist, says actually he's a good photographer, but he says, but this is not really interesting photography. What's interesting is the sculpture itself. Again, it's an appeal to the physical move, and he makes the repeat argument. He says this Englewood house is the latest in a series of spatial transformations in which Matta-Clarke calls Anarchitecture. He once studied to be an architect. See, that's a joke, right? For Art in America, that's extremely funny. But notice the gesture to always say he calls it an architecture and put the word an architecture in quotes. By the way, this is the standard. For those of you who wish to write about Matta-Clarke, understand that those are the rules. Whenever you mention an architecture, put it in quotations and say Gordon's word for it. Which is a bit like saying somebody has a disease, or they call it a disease. I'm not calling it a disease, they call it a disease. They have the disease of calling themselves to have a disease of a disease. It's kind of like, I don't know what architecture is, but he says it's that, and I like his stuff, and so therefore it is something of this order. So what Brunel says is, okay, an architecture doesn't start with this house in 1974, it starts with the first cuts of Matta-Clarke. So let's look at the cuts. We go back to 1972, you recognize the hair already. He's cutting into the wall of a building on 27th Street in Manhattan. You see he's slicing it into, and what's interesting is even when he's halfway through the slice, you see that one part of the house suddenly becomes like a painting relative to the other part of the house. I suddenly see ordinary objects of domesticity like another door and a kind of series of kitchen cabinets as if they are suddenly shockingly exposed to me as works of art. When he's finally completed the whole cut which goes through the door, not only has he cut through the normal division between one room and another, but the flexible division because it's a door, but we look from one room through another room and through that room through a window. So what's very, very interesting always from Matta-Clarke is to make a hole in the building that shows you that the building is already full of holes. It's crucial to understand Matta-Clarke that he doesn't think he's changing anything. Right? He thinks he's exposing the fact that houses are perforated, that we live in perforated space, we live in spaces full of holes. His major position is we regard the physical spaces that we inhabit as something we cannot change, intellectually or physically, and we live in them timidly. And this timid relationship we have to space is a form of political imprisonment, and it's highly repressive, that we are totally repressed. And what his work is trying to do is just unlock and enable you to see the space differently. And understand that it's easy, like it's not difficult to cut a hole. And he says, of course, you get a sense of complexity, right? But this is not a new complexity. The house was already complex. You simply didn't see it. He then does a kind of double move. He puts a hole in the floor and a hole in the wall in a project that he calls floors above, ceiling below. Like what's up is down and what's down is up. And once again, he's very fascinated to look through all of these holes. And what I would argue becomes important, if you look at the top left image, he cuts through all of the normal divisions of architecture. So actually, architecture becomes something very amorphous, very indeterminate. And what is determinate are the series of holes, the horizontal hole in the floor, the doorway, the window in the different distance, and so on. There's like a galaxy of holes, and they are very clearly, precisely defined. And then architecture is a kind of an amorphous field of potential around that. That's always his interest. And and this is what he writes on the back of this photograph, when he looks through it, of course, what happens when you see space differently is suddenly every detail of architecture becomes visible. Not just the way spaces are organized, and it's not just violating the space because I can see from room to room, floor to floor, and from one room through another floor, and through the window into the street, but I see all of the details of the structure, all of the things that normally prevent me from making those kinds of visions. So every detail, architecture is, in Matta-Clarke's work, brought right into your face. You can't avoid it. It becomes visible, it becomes palpable. It's like Marshall McLuhan argued that the role of the artist is to make anti-environments, because our environment is like water to a fish. A fish doesn't see water because the water is always there. We don't see architecture because it's always there. So the role of Matta-Clarke is to make a kind of anti-environment, an anti-architecture, which makes architecture, as it were, visible. He then first exhibits this work in a October 1972 exhibition at Green Street, and you see what he does. He puts a series of the building cuts, fragments of buildings on the floor, and a series of photographs on the wall. Again, if you write about Matta-Clarke, you definitely show this image, by the way. This one image is necessary. And you may note that there are photographs on the wall, but you probably don't. What you're interested in are the fragments of buildings on the floor because they look interesting, right? And you might stop at the first one. It's a piece of wall that has been removed from the restaurant food, and you see there's the fragment on the floor, and there's a photograph of the hole where the fragment came on the wall, and they're positioned, as you see in the image on the left, so you could easily imagine, as it were, reinserting the fragment. So it's a very complicated dance, because the fact of the fragment gives the photograph a sense of documentary sort of truth, but also the photograph gives the fragment a sense of truth. They're kind of complicit with each other. You could imagine that you could easily reinsert it, that it's very simple. A piece of, it's as if the piece of building comes out of that image. And by the way, the image, because it's kind of black and quite large, notice that he's printed it quite big, so it's starting to get to be the same scale, at least from this angle, that you can imagine that almost the black photograph is making a kind of a hole in the wall through which you see a hole in the wall, through which you see a hole in the wall. So basically, even the image on the left is extremely complicated, and this is the least complicated thing he ever did. In fact, he was not impressed by this at all. Is the one cut he never named. If you read the scholars, they will tell you this is called food. It was not called food, and they will tell you it was done in 1971. It was not done in 1971. The reason they'll tell you that is the food restaurant was opened in 1971. There it is on the left, being opened by Tina Gerard, Carol Gooden, and Matta-Clarke. So because the cut comes from the restaurant food, and the restaurant food, which was an artwork, was made in 1971, all our faithful scholars say photograph of cut from food 1971. Because for them, the photograph is not a work of art. It's just a document of a work of art, and that work of art must have been in 1971. But what they overlook is the fact, as you can see from these images on the right, in fact that cut was made by Matta-Clarke in 1972. We are looking now at the restaurant in 1972. In fact, these photographs are taken on the very day before the exhibition opened that I showed you before. In fact, these exhibitions are coming from the same roll of film, literally 3 frames over from the roll of film where that food photograph is taken. So the food photograph is taken in 1972, summer of 1972, of a hole which was cut into a wall that Matta-Clarke himself built in 1971. So he's not cutting into some ready-made architecture, he's cutting into his own architecture. And he said himself of this cut, this is the last time I ever made a cut for a kind of practical reason. Why? Because they needed to get the servery of the restaurant to work, right? So he hated this cut, right? The purpose of this cut in this exhibition, this is the straight man. This is the simple cut, simple hole, simple object. The whole reason of putting this into the show is to get you in the wrong way of thinking so that you would not understand the rest of the work in the show. At the end of the exhibition, by the way, he took that piece of wall and put it on the sidewalk and got rid of it. And this is a man that kept everything in his apartment. Every building and cut he ever did, he lived with, not this one. Right? So this is precisely for him not interesting. The photograph, which he didn't take, which a friend of his took, is now in the Whitney Museum as a work of art, dated 1971. Right? So just to give you a sense, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, I'm just saying let's think about what's really going on, or at least let's walk further down the wall. Okay, now we find the piece of wall that we saw before. This is Wraparound Wall. This is the horizontal one you saw before. You see it sitting on a table, and behind it seems to be a photograph of the hole that it came out of. You don't have to look at that photograph very long to realize that hole is not the hole that object came from, right? That's produced by 2 photographs looking through the hole at different angles, looking through one side of the hole at different angles. So he's produced an illusion of a hole that looks like it has the same proportion as the hole, so that you've been tricked by the first one, the food cut, so that you think, oh yeah, this is the hole that it came out of. He's showing us where it really came from. But you don't have to be, I'm not saying that art historians should look at art, but it seems to me it would be useful, right? So he's produced a photo work he's produced the illusion of a hole, which seems to have the same shape as the cut of the hole, but also notice that the two prints with which he's made that illusion have the same proportion as the hole. So again, you have the feeling that the fragment resonates with the photograph and with the hole in the photograph and with the hole in the distance in the photograph, because we appear to be seeing a horizontal window on the other side of the room. I could flash back just to remind you that there are two windows in that room that are two vertical windows, right? So he's constructed the illusion of a single horizontal window that simply doesn't exist. And again, my interest here is in what is it that he has done that has made the not very subtle photo work invisible to the very people who are celebrating the work of this artist. Let's move on. Here's another one, sitting on the floors. There's a piece of floors above, floors below. Again, you see it from an angle, it looks like a diagonal. You look up, you see a photograph of a hole. Looks like it fits into that hole. But if you look at the photograph, each of these has been produced by 4 separate prints being produced by 4 different angles. So basically he sat underneath the hole and made 4 different photographs from 4 different angles, then recombined them. In other words, you look through a hole, which is not the hole in the building, but it's a new kind of mythical hole through which you would see actually 4 different angles. So he's added a kind of vertiginous complexity to what was not there. And on the right-hand image, he's even sort of cut the prints at the angle of the hole to produce a kind of cut through the hole. So the hole has been cut and then it cut itself in. And you could say, well, I don't really think this is his best work, or you could say something like of that order. The one thing you could never say is, this is a photograph of the hole from which this has been cut. This would be certifiably stupid, right? Well, certifiably stupid, the commentary tends to be. Now, fragments of that work end up in museums like this one, very, very beautiful, but it's half a work, exhibited as a whole work, exhibited as a work that is a documentary photograph of a hole from which a fragment has come from. So we are kind of in a chain reaction here. My point is, obviously, I do think that people are less than inspired in the way they write about this stuff, but this is not the point. The point is more like, how is it possible for them to do that, or what kind of invitation has Matta-Clarke made to put his manipulations of the photographs just below the level of consciousness, even in highly conscious. Remember, it's not just that it's understood that Matta-Clarke is not just a physical artist, but a photographer. Actually, exhibitions and catalogs dealing with experimental photography of the period always include him. In other words, he's celebrated as a smart, interesting, conceptual photographer, and yet the very photographs he produces are not looked at. Let's go further down on the wall. So now we go further to the right. You see there are these 2 images here. You see it like this. These are never referred to. These simply don't exist. Right? They just don't exist in the writing about Matta-Clarke. And again, you might say, yeah, they don't exist because they're not very interesting. But when they are, but this is the photograph on the left from which they have been produced from. You can see he has produced there are 2 sets of 5 overlapping prints with which he's reproduced the building on the left, but he has changed the proportion on the left. He has removed the center of the building. You know those are from the walls photographs of Matta-Clarke. He's very interested that the inside of a building becomes visible on the outside when a piece of building falls down. He's not so interested in the middle where the light shaft still looks like a light shaft. So he just removes that and produces a new building. And of course, he produces a new building which is again split down the middle. So it's a photograph that's split vertically and horizontally. Nobody pays attention to that because everybody has their eye on the other wall, right, which is covered with the famous walls paper, which are photographs of walls, of distressed walls that have been turned into a wallpaper, very complicated, very, very sophisticated work. Those newsprint papers are also stacked in bundles on the floor. For $3, you could buy 4 of them. Then about 6 months later, he wraps. He doesn't sell very many, so he makes an artist book out of it. This is the cover of the artist book. Again, this cover makes its way into all discussion of Matta-Clarke, and it's always this image which is shown, and it's said to be a photograph of a building, but it ain't if you look at it just for half a minute. By now you're experts, right? Can't you see it's been produced out of can't you see the repetitions in the image? Don't you see that it's not a building, that it's got all these kind of hiccups in it? Each side of this image is produced by 4 prints. Each 4 print doesn't match the next print, but the gaps between the prints are the same dimension as the gaps between the floors, so he slid that into your unconscious, so you maybe vaguely have the feeling like it doesn't line up, but also at another level it does line up. Inside the book, it's split. So depending on how you open the book, these are the wallpaper. Just so you understand that that huge wall was colored like this. He of course has Andy Warhol very much in his mind. The original invitation to the exhibition was the very same image. He makes the cover of the book by making 4 photographs, photographing them twice, photographing them again, wrapping it around the book. He then cuts the book in half to make another book, in which all the images are like this, and on and on and on. And you could say, okay, yeah, it's interesting, what's not. But what's even worse is, this is the only photographs we have of Matta-Clarke making a photo work. If you're writing a book, if you're saying anything about Matta-Clarke, you always have some of these photographs from Cosmos, right? I just show you some of them. He's actually making that work, which we just discussed. So now you can get the one that has 2 sets of 5 prints. You can sense the size of the prints. It's not a small work, right? He's cutting them in the gallery. Everything else is already installed. He's assembled one half. He's working on the second half. And you could say why you care about that. But if you care about Matta-Clarke, you care about cutting, right? And you care about the physicality of cutting. So why is it that somebody whose work interests you because you're interested in the physicality of it and even the personal performance of it, why would you not be interested in their cutting of photography, their cutting of the negative? Of course, people who like Matta-Clarke love the fact that late in his career he shows you very obviously that he's cutting negatives, right? But that's not so interesting. He's saying like, look, I'm cutting negatives, and that people say, wow, it's interesting that he's cutting negatives. But what about when he's cutting negatives, and you should know he is, and he knows that you don't know, and he's just giving you slightly under your unconscious. But here you actually have pictures of him producing the work. Nobody to my knowledge has ever referred to these images as the production of a work of art. This is always photographs of him installing the exhibition at 112. He actually walks over at one point in the sequence and looks at the empty space on the wall where he's going to place that work of art. He walks back, thoughtful, starts cutting. And then in this image, which is an absolutely required image in any discussion of Matta-Clarke, he's caught. He looks up at us with an unbelievably coy look. I can show you like 10 photographs of him. This is a very knowing look. He knows that you know that this is like caught in the act kind of look. Okay, you caught me. But no one cares about the act. Right? Not a single person has ever commented on what the hell he's doing. So he could like cover himself with photographs and be cutting the photographs like this, and people will say, look at his hat, right? It's an astonishing blind spot. So the question becomes then, what is it about Matta-Clarke's cuts that are supposedly an architecture that we don't want to look at? Like, what's the relationship between exhibition that we can't see or don't see or never see, and what is it that we don't want to see in the work that we do see? Like, what is in there maybe unacceptable to us? This exhibition was extremely important for him. He really started to cut big time. So now he cuts on a threshold, because if you cut, he becomes like an acupuncturist. He thinks, what are the minimum number of cuts to produce the maximum effect? If I cut away the threshold of a building, not only can I look from below and above, even from the street, I can look up through the street and to my surprise, look up through the hole at the next floor and vice versa, right? Threshold, extremely important work. Double doors. What if I make my cut at 2 thresholds where 2 doors meet and I get this very, very complicated set of relationships between what's upstairs and downstairs? Bronx floor hole, amazing. What if I cut my hole near 2 windows? So now I can create a kind of dialogue between all the 4 windows of above and below and the sides. Astounding work. What if I just simply take the intersection of 4 walls and make my cuts? And again, you'll notice that not only are these photographs of the cuts which he makes, but almost all of them you're looking through to see windows in the distance. So these are always holes that reveal holes. In his own apartment, Cooper's cut. In Milan, Infraform, where he takes two concrete walls that meet, carves a triangle into those walls, and then observes the kind of complicated effects from this very acupunctural move. He's always looking at the weird way in what's below becomes part of what's above, the kind of complex relationships, as here in the floors. So a sort of strange sense in which the ceiling of the next floor appears to be the ceiling of this floor. Very, very sensitive to these kinds of relationships. Increasingly, he starts to appear. So here he is crossing the threshold. He's just looking at you, by the way. He knows you're there, right? And his girlfriend's dog is there, and he's now cut. You see him cutting. You see him everywhere. He's everywhere. Here in the middle, you have the project, the Cut House in Englewood, 1974. On the left, you have the project in Genoa, just a few months before that. and on the right you have Bingo in Niagara Falls a few months before that. It's 1974, he's cutting from 1971 to 1978. So this house in the middle, the house that you already know, the house that will make him known as an architect, is the exact center of his career of cutting. It's almost like the split through this house is the split through his career. But this is the three key projects, because these are houses, these are whole houses. These are not interventions into a house, but these are cutting the house itself as a system. This was transformative for him. In fact, the house on the left in Genoa, here you see him cutting into the roof, this is the huge breakthrough. He reinvents himself in Genoa. Everything he did in New York is rehearsal for this. Jamala Chalant will publish this article called Architecture in the Ready-Made, which will describe his relationship to the building is like Duchamp's relationship to the ready-made. And he will describe it as an architecture. The memory of the concreteness in the space within the interior emerges, then architecture becomes an architecture. He's saying this just a little bit before Laurie Anderson is saying it, so this is the first time an architecture is the label for this work. And in Chalant's mind, the label is coming just simply because an architecture must be against architecture. So for him, it was just a variation on the term radical architecture that he himself had been invented. Not a stupid article, all extremely interesting article. Here are two images that Matta-Clarke sends him for publication in that article. They are so Duchamp, I can't believe it, right? On the left, you not only look through the hole in the intraform, but what you see when you look through that hole, a chair. Like it's a super image of ready-made. And on the right, of course, Duchamp's doors are like, it's just not even obvious. Duchamp is his godfather. I mean, his actual godfather. You can say, I don't give a shit, that's just personal history. No, personal matters in this case. Duchamp is the ghost figure for all of, in my opinion, for all of the work of Matta-Clarke. So Chalant is super, super smart in tuning into this Duchamp aspect. This is the invitation to the image exhibition on the left. You see that the multiplication of photographs from the roof communicate already the kind of conceptual nature of the work, the seriality of it, also the impossibility of it, because how are we photographing that? Of course, it's being photographed from the very crane, which will be used to lift the very corner out. Here is the text that Matta-Clarke reads. It's an amazing text. By the way, in the middle of his training as an architect, he spends a year in the Sorbonne studying poetry. So getting back to this question, could he be a poet? Yes. Right? This is the first theory of the cuts. Right? So 1973, he is for the first time making an explicit theoretical argument about the cuts. Chalant will quote this in his article. He is thinking like an architect. He's treating everything he does with the building as a kind of conceptual move, and maybe this is what makes him an architect, not a particular attitude towards buildings, but the idea that anything done with physical space is by definition conceptual. The architect, from my perspective, is not somebody who draws a certain kind of line, but precisely somebody who doesn't draw a line between physical and conceptual. This is exactly what an architect is. An architect is somebody who believes that physical space can be a kind of discourse, operates as discourse. You see, of course, in the way that he draws in pen and pencil, he's an architect, no question about it. Right? This is the explanation of the Genoa house, the cutting of the roof and the cutting of the sides. This is the effect of those cuts, kind of horizontal cuts. This is how they are exhibited. Again, you can see that he's building on the strategy used in Green Street. The fragment is on the floor, but he, for the first time, is producing self-conscious works of art. He's not going to let you look at these and not see them, right? He's naming them for the first time, right? None of those photographic works that I showed you before have names. That matters. He's naming these. He's giving each of them a name. The dimension of them is very similar to the dimension of the cuts from which they are produced. But of course, they do very much what Laurie Anderson says. The alignment of the images preserves the line of the cuts. What dominates here is the line of the cuts, not the line of the photographs. You see how it looked on the wall above and how it is, on the wall and how it is. When you first walk into the exhibition, you meet this. Obviously an artwork, obviously serial, showing you, as it were, but also slightly rough in its organization. One could say a lot about this work. Immediately opposite is a cut drawing, so he's cutting into drawing, so he's cutting as a technique. If you look at the cuts, there are two levels of cut. One goes all the way through the paper and one goes just through the top layer, so that there's a kind of three-dimensional quality to the cuts. He invents at this exhibition in Genoa that photo assemblage technique, this cutting technique, which will become extremely important for Matta-Clarke. Here is the other work you will meet. This is Carol Gooden, who's a photographer and dancer, and is the reason that he's there in the first place, and she's helping him produce this work. And you see this is the other work, 4-ply, in which each of the facades of this sort of children-like house again have been isolated and abstracted on the wall, and immediately beside them is another cut drawing representing that roof. So he's heading down a kind of logical argument. There is also documentation on the walls of the cuts that he did before. Matta-Clarke is always presenting his work as a kind of evolution. It's like it's like one project, not many projects. So we see the cuts that you've already seen before. We even see, I think with the first one, he exhibits a photograph of a fragment of a building cut sitting on the floor, as if this would be something interesting to see in a gallery. So we're in November of 1973. It's very, you could say he's treating his own work as an art historian would treat it. These are like serial images which go from the beginning of the building to the end. He and his equipment are part of the image. He develops a system of representation. He proposes this system to represent his work for a publication in November. So he's seeing his work in this kind of way. Are you thinking of this art, or are you thinking of this documentation? He's calling it documentation. He's insisting this is documentation. He calls this a documentary resume. This is his resume. He puts the artist's resume on the walls. What's of course interesting about Matta-Clarke, as you can imagine, he really, really insists on the category of documentary photography as distinct from photo work. But of course, the more he insists on it, the more that ultimately the documentary photograph will receive the spectacular status of artwork, but also the artwork will receive the status of documentary. So my argument would be he insists on the division precisely because ultimately he wants to dissolve it, but over time, 1974 he starts producing, putting 4 of the documentary images into a single frame, and in a very interesting way he dates it as 1974. So again, the way this work is normally received is people will date it to the cuts, not to the photographs or to the photo works. He himself is dating it to the photo works. He does all 5 of the previous cuts are presented in this format of the 4 images. Okay, so far so good. We find ourselves towards the end of 1974. Everybody is saying that this is an architecture. By the way, don't be confused. Just because this is this extraordinarily celebrated artist, and I'm showing you an exhibition in New York and an exhibition in Genoa and a single article in Casabella, an architectural magazine, in truth, nobody knew who Matta-Clarke was. This is a very, very unknown, obscure figure, one of many, many obscure figures who now looks so famous and so interesting. So understand that, again, here we are looking at pages of Avalanche magazine, again, a magazine produced by the downtown art world for the downtown art world. And this is December in 1974, a very famous interview between Matta-Clarke and Liza Bear. What's interesting is that this interview comes out in 1974, but actually it was done the very day that splitting was finished. And it's the article in which the name splitting is first used, which is why I allow myself to call it splitting now when talking about this essay. So literally at the time that this was produced, before Challant says it's an architecture, before Anderson says it's architecture, before Brunel says it's architecture, before Lisa Lippard and all the others say that it's an architecture, he says in this interview, it's not. He's asked the question, do you see the Humphrey Street building as a piece of an architecture? No. Not complicated. On the first page of the interview, right? So if those of you who are very interested in portraying Matta-Clarke as an architect have to at least deal with this. You've got one possibility, which is to say, despite the fact that you think that everything he ever said about his work is the perfect expression of the work, this is the exception. That the one time he didn't understand his own work was when he was talking about an architecture in regards to the cuts, which are the center of Matta-Clarke. In other words, if you want to understand Matta-Clarke, you have to understand the cuts. If you have to understand the cuts, you have to understand splitting. Everything goes back to this house with Matta-Clarke, right? So you can say, yeah, I ignore this because he's wrong. He just was stupid in that moment. I defy you to find anyone ever quoting this line. What they will quote is what comes immediately afterwards. Anyone who ever says anything about this Anarchitecture exhibition for which there's no evidence it took place will quote him saying, no, our thinking about an architecture was more elusive than doing pieces that would demonstrate an alternative attitude to buildings and so on. So that's a standard. If your essay is a little bit longer, you will include this piece. The Anarchitecture show at 112 Green Street, which never got strongly expressed, so it's not, maybe it wasn't memorable because it wasn't that great, was about something other than the established vocabulary without getting fixed into anything too formal. By the way, it sort of means nothing. It's like advertising, innocent yet sensual, architectural yet not architectural, but still it's in. You've got a few more words, you have a happy editor that wants to give you more time, you can talk about this piece. I've always thought of you as working within an architectural context. No, architectural, not in the strict sense. Most of the things that have architectural implications are really not architecture, but non-architectural, but something that's an alternative to architecture. You know, good, included. You're really like writing the biggest book there ever is on Matta-Clarke, you put this piece in. Those attitudes are very deep. Architecture's environment too, when you learn, nobody does the middle, right? The way they deal with it is they put 3 dots, right? So they just jump across it like it doesn't exist. And if you're really brave, you just take the 3 dots out, like he never said it. Like this is the most massive, systematic, relentless denial that he ever said it was not an architecture. It's just like irritating that he would even think of such a thing. Despite the fact that this is the essay to understand Matta-Clarke. Matta-Clarke is primarily interpreted through 6 interviews, which seem like the way to do it, because he's being asked questions about his work. Is that a question? Oh yeah, that's good. That's good, yes. I mean, but then it's me showing you this in this particular way, right? But yes, they're cutting it out. Okay, you could say they're great, they're very innovative, they cut it out. It's true. Like they slide it right in, okay, fine. It's a good reading. I like it very much. Of course, your mission will be to decide, since I'm the one obsessing about him saying no there, whether ultimately I'm going to be the one that undoes this by talking about it but undoing it. But anyway, let's see. If you want to talk about Matta-Clarke, you have to talk about his interviews, and if you talk about his interviews, you talk about this one. This one is mined. By the way, the last interview he does, he interviews himself. Again, overlooked, but he does his own interview. He calls it an auto-dialogue. He says, after a while, it seems like it's better to answer your own questions. So he faithfully answers his own questions. So so these interviews are terribly important. Okay, we're going to go very, very fast. So let's look. What I'm saying is, to understand an architecture, you have to understand the cuts. To understand the cuts, you've got to understand splitting. Splitting is the most famous artwork, of that period, of that generation. This is like an image of this is in every museum. A piece of this building is in many museums. It is required reading. You know it. You know it so well. So here we are. I just want to point out and maybe I show you some things you haven't seen before, but in theory you already know this work. You see, of course, the shadow of Matta-Clarke. It's shadow of photography. There's photography everywhere in this work. He's looking down at one of the removed corners as if looking down onto a crime scene. And you see him up there on the roof, making that photograph. Look, take just one context sheet. This is the removal of one of the corners from the building. You can see the building, you can see the corner sliding down the edge of the building. Before the building gets to the ground, he's already photographed the effect of removing it from the inside. He's photographed what it looks like from the street now that the building has this strange new lump, because not only does it have a hole where the old corner was, but now it has an extra lump where the corner is coming down. He even photographs the thing as it gets down to the ground, but in fact it never gets to the ground. Here it is, sliding down. Notice that to take this photograph on the left, he has to hang out the side of the building to make the image. The first one he has to take by hanging from the roof. So it's a kind of the theatrics of photography. Here it is on its way down. In fact, it never gets to the ground because he puts it in a truck, and here's the truck, and here it is being placed in the truck, because he's going to immediately take it off to storage, because it's going to go into an exhibition, this exhibition at the John Gibson Gallery, which will be introduced with that work that you've already seen from Genoa, because he's always making the connection between the new work and the old work. And in that exhibition will also be a piece of Bingo, the Niagara building, sitting on the floor like a new kind of wall, but also the 4 corners that he's removed from splitting, which will now appear in a gallery as if the building is kind of coming up through the floor. Maybe less obvious, you can see in this photograph that on a side table, there's another photograph of splitting lent against the wall, which we don't have time to talk about. But we can talk about, this is the same corner you saw on the truck. So just to get you in the mood, there it is, right? Real, physical artist, crazy hair, crazy person, truck, a boy's toy, right? On its way to the gallery. By the way, he'd never injured himself while doing splitting, but he injured himself. He broke 3 ribs putting the installation up. So installation art is like tough physical work, and cutting a house is not. But there's the same corner, and you notice that there are 2 photographs in the gallery of the removed corner. So you see the corner and you see the corner from which it's been removed, the same trick as you saw before, but by now you're experts, so you're like, don't tell me that is really the corner. Then you go into a side room and you see a photograph of the corner coming down the side of the building that I showed you before, and on the floor a cut drawing representing that. So what he's done in this exhibition is made a chain of evidence that goes from the corner to the photograph of a corner, round the corner, to a photograph of a corner, to a cut drawing of a corner. So he's constantly playing with what is the object and what is the representation, what is the object, what is the representation. This is like the least accidental exhibition strategist that one knows, right? This is really like a Michael Asher style installation precision. At the same exhibition is released the little book Splitting, in which all the steps of the transformation of the house are shown. Each phase gets a photograph of all the facades plus 2 collages showing the effect of the removal. Each is is this art, is this documentation? It claims to be documentation. On the other hand, there are collages at the bottom. The collages are very much in the spirit of Laurie Anderson. Notice that the collages, as they become more complicated, turn horizontally. So it's the line in the collage that dominates rather than the horizontal line. When he gets to the final phase of removing the corners, you could say, oh yeah, but he doesn't do anything to the photograph. But notice that the photographs have been cut with the same proportion as the corner that's been removed. So unconsciously, you see the fragment of photograph and you make a kind of fragment, you associate it with the fragment that's been removed. Again, there's a hole in the page that is similar to the hole in the image which is on the page. Again, not stupid, you might say. It's not like the greatest work of art ever, but he's playing with you so insistently. And then finally at the end, he does this fold-out collage, which is a stunning work, and is the work. By the way, if you can only afford one image in your essay about Matta-Clarke, it has to be this one, because this is the image. So if Splitting is the project of Matta-Clarke, the image of Splitting is this. And notice what it is. He's photographed each of the rooms of the house from one side of the split of the house across the split to the other side. But of course, since the other side is leaning over, he's then brought it back to vertical simply by orienting the photographs. But the gaps between the photographs are where the structure of the house used to be. So what you actually see is not the cut of the house. In fact, the cut is not visible in this image because the image lies on the line of the cut. So it's like a medical image, like a forensic image where you would see all the inner sides of the building. But notice that actually such an image would not work. And you notice that going up the stairs repeat. Right? So something's not working out over there. There are in fact 4 different versions of what's going on in the stairs. Again, you don't notice that until I point it out, because you're not meant to notice it because he doesn't want you to notice it, but he spent weeks trying to make it possible for you not to see the fact that, of course, the stairways photographed from below and the stairways photographed from above can never meet in a photo collage. So he's added a black section and done a lot of carving. There's a lot of cuts within the cuts. Anyway, use that image. You must use that image. So retrospectives, exhibitions, catalogs, newspaper essays, it must be done. A little bit more rare, the cut book based on Splitting, which has the same image in it. Then, of course, on the left, you keep the project going by cutting a cake in a performance with Jean Dupé. Then your movie Splitting comes out, so there you are seen to be cutting, but the movie has the same structure as the book. It claims to be a documentary explaining all the various phases of the book. Now the person cutting the house is the star. What's interesting about that movie is you never see inside the house. So basically, it's a house, and it's a house that's being cut. You only ever see inside the walls of the house. You spend a lot of time actually inside the walls. Extremely interesting film. He then releases all the original images with which he made the Splitting book as signed originals, each 1975, each of them signed with the page number from the original. So there they are, all possible, the collages, all good, all great. You should have one. If you can afford it, maybe you want to buy this one because it was not in the book. So inside the set of original mechanicals for the book is an image which wasn't in the book. Who cares? Right? In the world of art, who cares? Like, who cares what the image is, where it's from, why it was done, when it was produced, when it was distributed, what its point was. Right? Who cares? That what was in the book, that's what you can buy. Then all sorts of collages not in the book start getting produced, then collages of collages, then color arrives. And I'm not showing you all, I'm just giving you a taste. Then Seberchromes, 76, 77, Seberchromes arrives. New generation. Notice that he's in the image. So it's a photograph of the work of Matta-Clarke in which he's part of the work, sold as, correctly, I think, as a Matta-Clarke photograph. Because who amongst us would be as naive enough to argue that you have to be pushing the trigger of the camera to be making the photograph? This is in every way a Matta-Clarke photograph. But the fact that he's in it alerts our attention to the nature of the work, combinations of prints, zebrachromes, big zebrachromes. This is really big. Now we're up to 40 by 60 inches. He's there a lot. He's naked, he's physical, he's a boy, he's like everything the art world wants, right? He dies young, right? So it's contributing to the mythology. 77, we show the negative holes because finally can we get people to wake up to the fact that these are photo works? But by now there's more than 100. So imagine, let's just say, 100 works of art, unambiguous works of art, circulating that are splitting. They're not like representations of splitting, they are what splitting is and always was, and he remains always part of them in every way. But what he's producing is a photograph, obviously, this is physical work, yeah, but it's physical work in the name of an image, images which will proliferate. And this is the first time one of those color images gets published, and not by accident. It's published by Germano Celant in 1975, and Germano Celant echoes the argument that he made in 1974, but no longer uses the word an architecture because he understands that it's not an architecture, and that Matta-Clarke doesn't think that it's an architecture, and everybody goes quiet. But what I want to argue to you is that what's very, very interesting is throughout this time in which Matta-Clarke is producing a kind of media ecology in relationship to splitting, and splitting is a media ecology, he's also very, very carefully selecting a group of images that he will not use in the artworks, and he will call them documentary images. And there's a set of, I would say, 27 images, and we're walking through the house. We're on the ground floor, we look left, we look right, we look up the stairs, we start working up the stairs, we look at the split, we get on angle with the split, we're looking up, further up, we then look down, slightly to the left, slightly to the right, we go right into the split itself. It's the kind of the halfway of the house. We're really facing the split, taking the split on. We move up, now looking down a bit on the split. We're now at the top of the stairs, looking back down. We enter that room, you recognize this image, so we're now on the second floor. We again look directly at the split. We look across the room, we open the door, we close the door. We look out the corners, all four corners. We look up to the ceiling through the attic. We enter the attic, we go up into the attic, and finally we're outside the house looking across the house. My argument would be that this set of 27 images exists as a kind of unconscious mosaic. It's as it were the fact of the cuts in our imagination. It has been deliberately placed there. These are normally seen only 2 or 3 or 4. You never see them like just to go through for it fast again. I'm arguing that he essentially made a picture, a mosaic picture, which he just carefully distributed to the media over the course of 5 years, which is made of these images. And he's very precise. On the back of each image is explaining the meaning of the image and the sequences of the images. And this is like the existence of this mosaic, in my opinion, as it were, pins down the cut. And in my opinion, there's a relationship between this pinning down of the cut and this releasing of this enormous media ecology, this dispersal of the project. The two are hand in hand. Of course, all of these images are now treated, perhaps correctly, as artworks, right, and appreciated in those terms. Overlooked is that many of them actually are coming originally from color photographs. The image, again, that you've seen now 4 times is coming from a colored slide, that there are many colored slides. Once you see the house in color, maybe it changes for you. Of course, if you want to present documentary images, black and white is more successful in communicating that. You will notice that in the black and white images, there are many variations of the same image, which the differences are never really noticed because they're, in a certain way, not that significant. But again, just to show you, before he's cut the house down the middle, but he hasn't opened it up yet. And already he's gone through the whole house and photographed it with the split running right through the middle of every single image. If you don't think this is the work of an unbelievably relentless, more than 1,000 images of this nature, conceptual photographer, then you're an idiot, right? To stand in a room, to look down with the camera, observe the widening of the gap, then look up, observe the widening of the gap. Circle it because you think that could be useful. He doesn't use it. But you see the gesture. This is not the wild man of Borneo, right? This is like relentless. Even this photograph, right? He's photographed quite carefully a corner before it's going to be removed, and photographed it so that you see that there's a kind of window to be, but not by accident. There's a light fitting. You see a kind of hole in the ceiling where you wouldn't expect it, where something has been pulled out. It's kind of, again, very, very thoughtfully, not disconnected in my view from a kind of surrealist attitude to photography. He's aware of what the little light fitting is doing to the way you feel about the corner, from my perspective, which is related to the uncanniness of this image in the first place. In other words, the uncanniness that we point out from the beginning. It is so carefully crafted. As I will point out to you later, every single plant you see in this image has been trimmed for this image. Every single plant has been trimmed for this image. So if you think this is just like a photograph of a work of art, and you don't think the photograph is the work of art, you're an idiot. Okay, finally, what the hell is an architecture show, you might ask? What I'm trying to argue is now maybe you understand what I think splitting was about and what the nature of the cuts were about. It's about unlocking a repressive attitude towards space by not transforming the space, but as it were, releasing your timidity about how space could be conceived. And he's saying that's not an architecture. What was an architecture? These are the photographs that were purportedly candidates to be exhibited, 20 by 16 black and white images in the Anarchitecture show. There are about 30 of these images in the Matta-Clarke archive. In theory, if you want to answer the question, what is an architecture, you just have to look at these images. So if you look at these images and you got it, then you got it. There's not much architecture in these images, but when it is there, it's usually falling apart or it's being devastated. Every now and then, architecture is there, seemingly untempered. It's everywhere you don't expect it to be. So maybe you just saw the exhibition, maybe not. Like, what is the relationship between these photographs that were kept in his own archive and the exhibition? They're the format, 20 by 16, that apparently was the format, but we don't know. The three images that look most like Matta-Clarke, because they're like holes in the wall, they're not Matta-Clarke, they're Susan Harris images, and a lot can be said about these images. There's very little relationship between what you saw and this, except that everything you see in this that was in that set I just showed you has been changed. Right? So the text which is on the newspaper photograph is removed, or in the reverse, text is added, text is written by hand on the right, the hand is Matta-Clarke's. We can see in the archives he's experimenting with this. So we know, more or less, that Matta-Clarke is the one who does the flash art thing, but we have no idea what's the relationship between the flash art spread and the original show. We know he's rephotographing some of the original photographs that were candidates to be in the show, but which were the photographs to be candidates in the show? If he had 30 images in his archive, Gene Hystine had about 27, Richard Nonis had about 20, Gina Gerard had about 20. So actually, if we take all of the archives of all of the artists involved, we have to add these images. So if you figured out what an architecture is, you have to now absorb these thoughts. So these are Bernie Kirschenbaum, Gene Hystine. Notice, by the way, that the set of photographs for inclusion in the Anarchitecture show include a photograph of an aerogram that Matta-Clarke sent from Amsterdam to the rest of the group saying we better do a show and here are my ideas for the show. So you could say, oh yeah, well in conceptual art you can show the instructions for a show in a show. That would actually be the best show. By the way, if you have the instructions for a show, you don't even have to show them in the show because you already have shown them right? But nevertheless, he photographed them. This is the aerogram, and if you read the aerogram, many of the images you just saw are perfectly explained, right? But not many of them. You know, the cow that seems to have a hole in it, which is really produced by a rock, it relates to a cow thing in the aerogram. The building's collapsing. It's all explained, but certain images just don't get explained. By the way, a lot of the photographs are taken in and around and of Matta-Clarke's own apartment. So these are photographs from his loft. There's the dog, NYU. And then there is one photograph in the contact sheets, which is the photograph from which the invitation from the show was produced. This is the only photograph. You see it's not in very good condition. There's a big scratch through the emulsion. That didn't worry them. Like maybe an emulsion with a scratch in it is more anarchitectural than not. And you see that it's printed. Then Matta-Clarke writes by hand what the date should be, and then that's typed in to become part of the image. the invitation card you would receive, but it's not so simple because there's another version in which the scratch and the emulsion has been removed carefully, and he's rewritten the instructions again on a cleaned up emulsion. So all of this is sounding not so accidental, right? When he sends those aerograms, he says he's out of control, that he's crazy, that he's desperate, that he just wrote these in a kind of spontaneous rush. That's a lie. He carefully sketched out in great detail each and every sentence in the aerogram. The aerogram is a very, very precisely written small version of this larger version. And if you know Matta-Clarke, he never writes without crossing things out. So this is not the first version, this might be the 10th version. He wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote before he wrote this aerogram, which he says, just a few thoughts, crazy, I'm drunk, I'm crazy. Not at all. And it's not just 20 ideas for what to do in the show, but it's 20 ideas for word works, for conceptual works, for diagrams. Even there is the instructions on how to produce the variations on the word Anarchitecture, which will become finally the image on the right, which is done by Tina Gerard. Even that very first piece of evidence we showed you of the announcement in the pages of Avalanche was a note from Gordon Matta-Clarke to Liza Bear, who, by the way, was at Splitting when the corner was being removed and filmed the removal of the corner and was involved in the production of the Splitting book. She's not like an artist, journalist friend who just, in conversation, she's a conspirator and accomplice, and she's receiving this note from him before he even leaves for Europe. So the Anarchitecture show was not this spontaneous thing that just happened because there was a gap in the gallery. It's a very long resting plan. Many of his note cards refer explicitly to Anarchitecture. Again, you can read them because it says things like Anarchitecture is, so if you're not feeling like doing too much work, you could just read those cards and he will give you the answer. Many of the cards, we could take even 10 of the cards, and if we put them together, we probably get the most beautiful, most clear explanation for the Anarchitecture group as a kind of philosophical seminar on the question of Anarchitecture. Not a single member of the group remembers him making these cards. When they read them, they say, yeah, that's Gordon, but what's the relationship between the Architecture show? I don't know, he never saw those. I mean, that's his private stuff. You know, they get a bit nervous about them. This is the only photograph of an Anarchitecture meeting we have. So that's Ree Morton, Richard Nonis. You see Matta-Clarke is preparing Matta-Clarke, each meeting was apparently 1 tequila bottle long. Tequila was his thing. The tequila is on the table, he's rolling a joint. Everybody's patiently waiting. There's no happiness yet, he's still rolling, but they're being photographed. Remember, this is the show doesn't get photographed, but a meeting about the show definitely, right? And then he's done it. Everybody's happy, and the camera starts sort of moving around the table. We see Susan Harris, amazing artist, Ree Morton on the left, Gene Heistein in the middle. Again, if you're interested in this gang, they're not boring. They're a really very interesting group of artists. Matta-Clarke is kind of like got the conversation going, got everybody loose. Laurie Anderson arrives. Notice it's now daytime. They all said the meetings lasted for about an hour, but we just went from the night. This is nighttime. It's the day. Ree Morton and Jeffrey Liu have left, and Laurie Anderson has arrived. Laurie Anderson gets hold of the camera and starts photographing. We can go into the photographs if you want to get forensic on this, and you know I want to. And she takes this one image down the table, which is my favorite, because there is Gordon. He's no longer rolling a joint. He's at the end with a typewriter. It's the morning. Again, he looks back at you with the same look he gave every time you catch him caught in the act. But what's the act here? The act of the theorist, the act of the writer. Even the page of type is glowing, right? Glowing as if something magical has occurred. He's also sort of saying, you got me. He's moved from the loosener of conversation in chief to the main representative of Anarchitecture. It's on its way out. He's doing many, many diagrams of what Anarchitecture could be, or what an exhibition could be, of what posters could be, documents could be. He's making these kinds of quotes which become very important in the interpretation of his work. These are the same quotes that are used by Germano Chalant. He's theorizing what looks like architecture, but remember, for him, Anarchitecture and the cuts are different, and yet the language he's using about the cuts seems to be the same. Maybe the tree thing was not so accidental after all. You look at the way he draws the tree. He draws the tree like an architect would draw the tree. Of course, it's tree architecture. He's making an architecture to hang in the tree. He called it a house. He's making a house, a tree house. And he draws the tree like it's a piece of architecture, but he also draws trees. This is a typical drawing of a tree from the same period. He called it energy. And if you look at it, it's made up of little bits of architecture. So he draws a tree as if it's a building, and he draws a building like it's a tree. He's really into this tree architecture thing. The treehouse is not just an accidental move in 1971. This is a 1969 performance where he hangs himself from the top of a pier to come down and touch a tree, and choreographs and organizes this photograph so that the World Trade Towers will be in the background. World Trade Towers are frequently part of the discussion. This is the first mention of the word in architecture. It's about a tree. It's a photograph of a tree. The photograph makes its way into the documentary. He's talking about trees, thinking about trees. Alan Surratt writes to him, says, your thing is all about trees. You guys are tree lovers. You should be like animals living in trees. If we go back to the bus trip where everybody went to see Splitting, if you look at it, they arrive, they see the house full of trees. It's all about trees, trees cut, everywhere, trees. Up on the roof, Laurie Anderson, Richard Nonis, up on the roof, looking down, looking across. Laurie Anderson looks down, you look down through the cut at trees. It's all about trees. You look across to Wegman, who's climbed the tree on the opposite. They're like tree obsessed. Remember those photographs I'm showing you? They're all about trees. Right? Like maybe really it is a tree house, and just to remind you, when the interview with Liza Bear was taken, they were trimming the tree for this photograph. And then when you look, you see it's weird what he does with the trees. The trees are like a big deal throughout. And every time you see trees, it's got, in color it looks like this. So it's basically a kind of a tree house. We should end. My main point is not to sort of try to answer the question, what is an architecture, but to sort of zoom in and try to understand Matta-Clarke as well as possible using the evidence that's available in the archives. And if you use that evidence, all the evidence is of an unbelievably hardcore kind of philosophical conceptual artist working through a very, very systematic set of issues that I've concentrated only on the cuts that are going from like 71 to 75. I don't talk about any of the stuff that comes afterwards, none of the dances, none of the performances, none of the music, none of the poetry, none of all the other stuff. But it is my opinion that it can all be understood in these terms. And just notice that he can't even type the word Anarchitecture. It just doesn't come out. It comes out Anarchitecture, it's like this. This is kind of like the very best image there is of Anarchitecture. You would have been wise not to come to this lecture and just to look at this image. Thanks. I think everybody's destroyed. We should just, yeah, but fast. Yeah.
Did you ever practice cutting things? Was it so much different materials you cut the house? I think it sounds really complicated.
So did he practice cutting?
Cutting different stuff. Was this his first cut?
No, he's in my opinion, the cuts really started in 1972. But he has already been theorizing the cuts. So first thing I would say, he theorizes cuts for 2 years before he cuts. And then when he cuts, he's doing many, many cuts. So he's doing many unsuccessful cuts, and we don't know about them. Yeah, so you're right. He's practicing a lot. He doesn't know what the effect of many of the cuts will be, so he has a friend, Bernie Kirschenbaum, who's an architect, who's often saying to him, don't do it. So he has a wisdom about what holds a building together. Cedric Price, the great Cedric Price, always argued that nobody should be allowed to build a building who doesn't know how to take a building apart. So Matta-Clarke is exactly an example of somebody who understood what it would take to take a building apart, and therefore knew what it was that held it together. If you look at some of the late work, like Circus in Chicago, there seems to be no building left, but it's a 4-story building in which it seems that everything has been removed. So I mean, he's good. If good means taking it to the limit. Right? Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember saying that, but he would. One way to understand the difference between the cuts and an architecture is that he would say the cuts were about voids, like yes, But an architecture was about the voids in our understanding of voids. So this is what he meant by it's more elusive. They're not separate things. It's a matter of degree. Like the cuts are still like too obvious. They're still sort of sitting there in a too determined, too clear way. They are, even if they are anti-architectural, they still have architectural properties, like in the normal sense. And architecture was interested in the voids in our understanding, right? And just to be clear, when he cuts the building, he says it's a mental work. In other words, what he's playing with is your perception of space. So he thinks the cuts are mental. It's not like an architecture is physical and an architecture is not. It's just that it's two levels of mental work. And with cuts still lingers there. The enemy, as it were, still lingers there. And architecture wants to be more elusive and doesn't want a void to look like a void. So, for example, when you look at the corner that's been removed, if you think of that as a void, then it's not a void. Right? So an architecture is about this much more complicated thing. Another way to say it is, if you look at all the examples of the group, they were really good at finding architecture where you don't expect it. So they said, for example, when two cars pass each other, there's a sort of a temporary space just for a moment. That's architecture. And they're very good at taking architecture as you normally find it and dissolving it. So they're really good at undoing architecture on one side and finding it where it's not expected at the other. And that's really what they were into. It was explicitly political, but not political in the sense of, Matta-Clarke was very, very committed to social justice in the sense that he felt like the economy, particularly in the 1970s, was racially, gender-wise, in every possible way, oppressive and repressive, and he's very known for his kind of political activism. But he argued that rich people in their houses are just as imprisoned as people without houses. In fact, people without houses show a level of creativity in relationship to space that prisoners in their suburban mansions do. So for him, politics meant not simply serving those that are neglected, which he was committed to, but trying to intervene in what he thought was the ultimate political oppression, which was to think that space was fixed. Right? So when he says void, he wants to make a void in your sense that you can't change the space that you live in. Right? That's his model. And that might not mean making an actual void.
Okay, this is going to be the last one.
Question than the answer is going to be, but I think it's all of the above, and I try to put some hierarchy to that. Of course, I'm not. I can see the photographs because I don't know anything about photography, right? And I'm coming from the architecture team, so I'm kind of curious what's in the image, right? So if you say it's a photograph of a hole, well, playing for the architects team, I'm interested. What kind of hole is that? The art historian doesn't really care what kind of hole it is, because just the idea of a hole sounds sort of terrific already. But that's so insulting to Matta-Clarke, right? To say, you just make holes and I don't care about the size of your hole. So there's a very, very weird way. My general argument, as you know, is sort of like, Matta-Clarke, in my opinion, remains threatening, remains a very threatening figure, and the way that that threat is dealt with is to put him on a pedestal, and he becomes the boy who could do no wrong. And you could accuse me of the same, like I didn't criticize him yet, right? The boy who does no wrong, and what he does that is being celebrated is so much less, in my opinion, than what he did. So in other words, he's sort of being praised in a very safe area. So I think you're right in your first observation that the problem is a wider one. That is to say, the kind of clumsiness around the question of the document and of the photograph, you would have thought, particularly given that in the 70s, so many artists were concentrating on that exact issue. In other words, part of what I'm doing is just placing him in a group, in a wider group of artists who were challenging our understandings of what constitutes a documentary, whether it be photography or film. And it would seem that none of the work they did yielded an intelligence growth in those that write about art. To which you could say, as I have obviously implied, because people who write about art are stupid. Well, that's absolutely not the case. These people are very cannily writing in a way that fits a set of assumptions. So there's something about dislodging the status of documentary photography that dislodges wider issues. How to make such a comment without discussing Donald Trump? Right? To what extent is Trump's entire intellectual project to destabilize the status of documents, right, successfully? So we live in a time in which he's managed to make it that no form of evidence adequate, right? So it would seem to me that our clumsiness about documents is also a kind of a general clumsiness, by which I don't mean social media is like is like everything is fantasy. No, because that's a very precise world. I just think we are not as sophisticated about images as we would like to think. And I almost feel like he literally had to do more clumsy work to be collectible. And you can map it. You can see that at some point he does much more simple, straightforward work that fits within the tradition of Hannah, etc. Right? A more clearly, easily identifiable sort of surrealist collage tradition, and I think he just moved into that space because nobody could even see the other stuff. And he always talked about this, like it's not like a hidden thing. He was like, anyway, it's a bad answer to your question. I don't know enough about photography to be able to say what to do. And the person you referred to, I want to read. Are you going to be the lucky last? Or are you saying let's finish? Yeah. I mean, alcohol. I mean, the tequila thing is not